Hi, I'm Marcus. They told me I'd never amount to anything, that I'd live in their basement forever, like some kind of charity case. My own stepfather laughed when I said I wanted to buy the empty lot next door. With what money? He sneered. Your pizza delivery tips? 3 years later, I handed him the keys to a $20 million mansion I built on that very lot. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about family, respect, and revenge. But here's the question that still keeps me awake at night. When does proving them wrong become proving yourself right? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When I was 26, I lived in a converted basement that smelled like mildew and broken dreams. The ceiling was so low I had to duck walking from my bed to the makeshift kitchenette my stepfather had thrown together with leftover cabinets from his construction jobs. The single window, barely larger than a shoebox, sat at ground level, offering me a daily view of people's shoes as they walked past on the sidewalk above. Most mornings, I'd wake up to the sound of my stepmother's heels clicking across the kitchen floor directly over my head, followed by the inevitable commentary about how pathetic it was that a grown man still lived with his parents. Richard wasn't my real father. He'd married my mother when I was 15, right after my dad died in a motorcycle accident that left us with nothing but medical bills and a mortgage we couldn't afford. Richard swooped in like some kind of savior, paid off the debt, and moved us into his house in Millbrook Heights. For the first few months, he played the role of the caring stepfather perfectly. He'd ruffle my hair at dinner, ask about school, even help me with my homework a few times. But once the papers were signed, and my mother's gratitude had settled into routine, his true nature surfaced like oil on water. The basement wasn't originally meant to be living space. Richard had finished it hastily when I turned 18 and refused to leave for college. I couldn't afford it, and frankly, my grades weren't good enough for any scholarships worth having. He'd stood at the top of the basement stairs that summer, arms crossed, looking down at me like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe. "If you're going to freeload," he'd said, "at least do it where I don't have to look at you every day." So down I went. The space was 800 square feet of poured concrete and exposed pipes. He'd thrown up some drywall to create the illusion of rooms, installed the cheapest carpet remnants he could find, and called it finished. The bathroom was an afterthought, wedged into a corner with a shower stall so narrow my shoulders touched both walls. The water pressure was whatever was left after the rest of the house had taken its share, which meant most of my showers were lukewarm at best. My mother, Patricia, had grown quieter over the years. The woman who used to stand up to teachers when they treated me unfairly, who'd worked double shifts at the diner to keep us afloat after Dad died, had somehow shrunk into Richard's shadow. She'd bring me meals sometimes, standing awkwardly at the bottom of the stairs with a plate of leftovers, but she never stayed long. Never asked how I was doing, never acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't how a family was supposed to work. Richard owned a mid-sized construction company that specialized in custom homes for Millbrook Heights' growing population of tech executives and finance managers. Business was good, which meant his ego was even better. He drove a new Ford F-350 every 2 years, wore expensive boots that he somehow kept spotless, despite claiming to work construction, and loved reminding anyone who'd listen that he'd built his success from nothing. What he'd actually built it from was my mother's insurance settlement and the connections that came with marrying into the Riverside Country Club set, but nobody seemed interested in those details. The house itself was Richard's monument to his own success. 4,000 square feet of marble countertops, hardwood floors, and windows so large they required professional cleaning twice a month. The master suite alone was bigger than most apartments, complete with a walk-in closet that could have housed a small family and a bathroom that looked like something from a luxury hotel. Meanwhile, I lived below it all like some kind of basement troll, listening to their dinner parties through the heating vents, hearing Richard's friends laugh at his jokes about his lazy stepson, who couldn't get his act together. I'd been working at Tony's Pizza Palace for 3 years by then, not because I loved making pepperoni pizzas for drunk college kids, but because it was one of the few jobs that let me work nights and weekends while I tried to figure out what came next. The pay was terrible, minimum wage plus tips that barely covered gas for my beat-up Honda Civic, but Tony was decent enough to let me take extra shifts when I needed them. Most nights, I'd come home smelling like cheese and marinara sauce, my pockets heavy with ones and fives that I'd count out on my bed before hiding them in an old coffee can behind my dresser. Richard loved pointing out my employment situation whenever he had an audience. "Marcus here is really making something of himself," he'd say with that practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "Pizza delivery. Very entrepreneurial." His friends would chuckle politely while my mother stared at her plate, pretending she didn't hear the contempt dripping from every word. The empty lot next door had been sitting undeveloped for as long as I could remember. 2 acres of prime real estate that backed up to the lake, with mature oak trees and a gentle slope that would have been perfect for a house with a walkout basement. I'd walk past it every morning on my way to the bus stop, and every evening when I walked back from work. Something about that land called to me, maybe because it represented possibility in a neighborhood where I felt like nothing but a disappointment. The property had been tied up in some kind of estate dispute for years. The original owner, an old woman named Helen Morrison, had died without a clear will, and her various relatives had been fighting over it in court ever since. I'd looked it up at the county courthouse one afternoon, when I had nothing better to do. The legal documents were thick as a phone book and twice as confusing, but the basic story was simple enough: too many heirs, not enough agreement, and lawyers getting rich while the land sat empty. I started researching the property obsessively. I'd spend hours at the public library, using their computers to pull up tax records, zoning information, soil surveys, anything I could find. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just a pipe dream. The land was zoned for residential development. The soil test showed excellent drainage. The setback requirements would allow for a substantial home, and the elevation changes meant incredible views of the lake from a properly designed house. But research was easy. Actually buying the property would require money I didn't have, credit I'd never established, and a level of financial sophistication that pizza delivery hadn't exactly prepared me for. Every time I ran the numbers, they told the same story. Marcus Rivera, basement dweller, with a high school diploma and a 3-year-old Honda, had about as much chance of buying prime lakefront real estate as he did of being invited to join the country club. Richard found out about my interest in the property the way he found out about most things in my life, by going through my stuff when I wasn't home. I'd left some of my research papers on the small desk I'd cobbled together from milk crates and a piece of plywood, and apparently that was invitation enough for him to conduct his own investigation. He was waiting for me when I got home from work one Tuesday night, sitting on the edge of my bed with my notes spread out in front of him like evidence in a trial. "What's all this?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he already knew exactly what it was. He held up a photocopy of the property survey, shaking it slightly for emphasis. "You planning on becoming a real estate mogul, Marcus?" I set down my delivery bag and tried to keep my voice steady. "Just looking into some things." "Looking into some things," he repeated, savoring each word like it was personally amusing to him. "You know what this land is worth, right? Even with all the legal problems, we're talking about at least $800,000 just for the dirt. That's before you even think about building anything on it." I did know. I'd looked up comparable sales in the area, had even driven by some of the recent builds to get a sense of what people were spending. The numbers were staggering, but not impossible. Not if you knew what you were doing, had the right connections, understood how to leverage financing and partnerships, and all the other tools that separated dreamers from doers. "I'm not planning anything," I said, which was technically true. Planning implied I had some kind of concrete strategy, when what I really had was a growing obsession and a collection of public records that I'd read so many times I could recite them from memory. Richard stood up, gathering my papers with exaggerated care. "Good," he said. "Because for a minute there, I thought you might be getting ideas above your station." He paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at me with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been wrapped in so much condescension. "The Morrison property is going to sell eventually, Marcus. When it does, it'll go to someone with real money. Someone who understands how these things work. Not someone who counts pizza tips to make rent." The sting of his words followed me for days.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Not because they were cruel, though they were, but because they contained just enough truth to burrow under my skin and stay there. I was counting pizza tips. I was living in a basement that flooded every time it rained hard. I was 26 years old, with no degree, no real skills, and no apparent prospects beyond delivering food to people who lived in houses I'd never be able to afford. But something else happened in the days after Richard's little intervention. Instead of discouraging me, his dismissal lit something inside me that I hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was just the accumulated weight of 3 years' worth of casual humiliation finally reaching a breaking point. Whatever it was, it made me stop seeing the Morrison property as an impossible dream and start seeing it as a problem that needed solving. I began staying late at the library, not just researching the property itself but diving deep into real estate development, construction financing, zoning law, anything that might give me an edge. I learned about tax liens and judicial sales, about how distressed properties sometimes sold for far less than their appraised value. I studied successful developers, reading everything I could find about how they'd gotten started, what mistakes they'd made, what strategies had paid off. Most importantly, I started paying attention to the legal proceedings surrounding the Morrison estate. The courthouse records were public, which meant I could track every filing, every motion, every delay in the seemingly endless probate battle. What I discovered was that the family wasn't just fighting over who should inherit the property, they were running out of money to keep fighting. The legal fees were bleeding the estate dry, and the various heirs were starting to pressure their lawyers to find some kind of resolution, even if it meant accepting less than the property's full value. That's when I learned about something called a partition sale. When heirs can't agree on how to divide an inherited property, a court can order it sold and the proceeds distributed according to each heir's legal share. The catch is that partition sales are often conducted as auctions, which means they don't always bring top dollar. Motivated sellers, limited marketing, and complicated title issues can create opportunities for buyers who know what they're looking for and come prepared to move quickly. I started attending public auctions around the county, not to bid on anything but to understand how they worked. I watched buyers who came prepared with cashier's checks and pre-approved financing, who knew exactly what they were willing to spend and stuck to their limits no matter how heated the bidding became. I saw properties sell for 60 or 70 cents on the dollar, sometimes less, because most people weren't comfortable with the uncertainty and complexity of auction purchases. More importantly, I started networking with the people who made these deals happen. Auctioneers, real estate attorneys, title company representatives, the small-time investors who made their living buying distressed properties and flipping them for profit. Most of them were happy to talk to someone who asked intelligent questions and didn't waste their time. Some of them even started calling me when interesting properties came up, not because they thought I was a serious buyer, but because I'd proven I understood the business and wasn't just another tire kicker. It was through one of these contacts, a real estate attorney named Susan Chen, who specialized in probate matters, that I learned the Morrison property was finally headed for a partition sale. The court had grown tired of the family's inability to reach agreement, and the estate's dwindling funds meant the legal proceedings couldn't continue indefinitely. The auction was scheduled for the second Thursday in October, exactly 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to figure out how a pizza delivery driver with $8,000 in savings could compete with real estate investors and development companies for a piece of prime lakefront property. 6 weeks to turn years of research and wishful thinking into an actual executable plan. 6 weeks to prove that Richard was wrong about what I could accomplish. The night I found out about the auction date, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my makeshift desk with a calculator and a legal pad, working through every possible scenario I could imagine. Traditional financing was out. No bank was going to give me a construction loan based on my current income and credit history. Joint ventures were possible but complicated. I'd need to find a partner willing to put up most of the money in exchange for most of the profit. Private money lenders were an option, but their interest rates were brutal and their terms usually favored experienced borrowers with established track records. What I needed was a way to buy the property with minimal cash down and maximum time to figure out the development piece. What I found, buried in the fine print of the auction documents, was a provision that allowed for a 10% down payment at the time of sale, with the balance due within 30 days. 30 days to secure permanent financing, find development partners, or flip the contract to another buyer for a profit. 30 days was still a tight timeline, but it was workable. If the property sold for anywhere near its appraised value, 10% would be around $80,000, which was still far more than I had. But if the lack of marketing and complicated title issues kept some bidders away, if the sale happened to fall on a day when the usual suspects were tied up with other deals, if I got lucky and the bidding stayed reasonable, maybe 10% would be something I could manage. That's when I started thinking seriously about my pizza delivery money for the first time in years, not just the nightly tips that bought gas and groceries, but the bigger picture. 3 years of working 6 days a week, picking up every extra shift Tony would give me, saving every dollar I didn't absolutely need to spend. The coffee can behind my dresser held more than just pocket change. It represented thousands of hours of dealing with drunk customers, rude managers, and Richard's constant commentary about my lack of ambition. I counted it all one Saturday morning while Richard and my mother were at the country club. Bills and coins spread across my bed like the world's most modest treasure hoard. $8,437. Not enough to buy anything significant in Millbrook Heights, but enough to get serious about making something happen. The problem wasn't just the money, though. The problem was that I'd spent so many years being treated like Richard's charity case that I'd started believing it myself. $8,000 wasn't nothing. But it wasn't enough to command respect either. What I needed was a way to turn that modest savings into something that looked like real purchasing power, something that would make other people take me seriously as a buyer. That's when I remembered something my real father had told me years before he died. He'd been a small-time contractor, nothing like Richard's operation but honest work that kept food on the table and a roof over our heads. One of his favorite sayings was that you didn't need to be the smartest guy in the room or the one with the most money, you just needed to be the one who wanted it most and was willing to work the hardest to get it. I started working harder. Not just at Tony's, but on understanding every aspect of the Morrison property deal. I drove by the land at different times of day, taking photos and making notes about traffic patterns, neighborhood demographics, the types of houses being built nearby. I researched comparable sales going back 5 years, creating spreadsheets that tracked price per square foot, time on market, and final sale prices, versus original asking prices. Most importantly, I started building relationships with the people who could help me turn opportunity into reality. I met with Susan Chen and paid her for an hour of legal advice about auction procedures and title issues. I talked to contractors about rough construction costs for different types of houses. I even visited the planning department at City Hall to understand the zoning requirements and permit processes that would apply to any development on the Morrison lot. What I learned was both encouraging and terrifying. The property was everything I'd hoped it would be: properly zoned, appropriately sized, and positioned perfectly to take advantage of the lake views that made Millbrook Heights so desirable. The complicating factor was that developing it properly would require not just buying the land, but having enough capital left over to start construction immediately. Vacant land didn't generate income, which meant every month of delay cost money in carrying costs and lost opportunity. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just about buying a piece of property. This was about proving something to myself, to Richard, to everyone who'd written me off as a basement-dwelling loser with no prospects and no ambition. The Morrison property represented a chance to rewrite the story of my life, to transform myself from the guy who delivered pizzas to the guy who built something significant. But wanting something and being able to afford it were two different things, and as the auction date approached, the gap between my dreams and my bank account felt wider than ever. $8,000 was real money, but it wasn't nearly enough to compete with serious investors who could write checks for the full purchase price without blinking. That's when I started thinking about creative financing in earnest. Not just traditional bank loans, but the kinds of deals that happened between individuals who understood risk and reward. Private money lenders who specialized in short-term real estate deals. Wealthy individuals who wanted to invest in local development but didn't want to deal with the day-to-day details of construction and sales. I spent 2 weeks cold calling investment groups and individual lenders, explaining my research on the Morrison property and my vision for what could be built there. Most of the conversations went nowhere. People were polite but dismissive once they realized I had no track record and minimal capital to contribute. But a few were intrigued enough to ask for more information, to request detailed financial projections and development timelines. One of those conversations led to a meeting with a retired businessman named Frank Martinez, who specialized in real estate partnerships. Frank had made his money in manufacturing, but had been investing in Millbrook Heights development projects for years. He was impressed by my research and my passion for the project, but he was also brutally honest about the challenges I'd face as a first-time developer. The Morrison property is a great opportunity, he told me over coffee at a diner that definitely wasn't in Millbrook Heights. But opportunity and execution are two different things. You can buy the land, but can you navigate the permitting process? Can you manage contractors and subcontractors? Can you handle the inevitable cost overruns and construction delays? Because if you can't, you'll lose everything you put into it and then some. Frank's questions were fair, and they forced me to think beyond just acquiring the property to actually developing it successfully. I realized I needed more than just financing. I needed mentorship, guidance from someone who'd navigated these waters before and could help me avoid the most obvious mistakes. That conversation led to a proposal that seemed too good to be true. Frank would provide the financing to buy the Morrison property if I could win it at auction for a reasonable price. In exchange, he'd take a 60% stake in the development profits but would also provide the additional capital needed for construction and the expertise to manage the project from start to finish. It wasn't the solo success story I'd originally envisioned, but it was a real path forward, a way to turn my research and passion into an actual business opportunity. The auction was set for 10 in the morning on a Thursday that dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that made everything look tired and uninspiring. I'd barely slept the night before, running through scenarios and contingencies until my head felt like it might explode. Frank had given me a maximum bid of $750,000, which was aggressive but not crazy given the property's potential value. Richard was already at work when I left the house that morning, which meant I didn't have to endure any commentary about where I was going or what fool's errand I was pursuing. My mother was in the kitchen when I grabbed my coffee, but she didn't ask questions. She'd learned years ago not to get involved in whatever tension existed between Richard and me. The auction was held at the courthouse steps, a location that felt appropriately dramatic for what I hoped would be a turning point in my life. About 30 people had gathered by the time the auctioneer arrived, though it was hard to tell who were serious bidders and who were just curious onlookers. I recognized a few faces from other auctions I'd attended, serious investors who knew how to evaluate properties quickly and bid strategically. The auctioneer was a thin man in his 60s who handled the proceedings with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. He read through the legal description of the property, outlined the terms of sale, and answered a few questions about title and possession dates. Then he opened the bidding at $500,000. For the first few minutes, the action was slow and methodical. Bidders raised their hands or called out increases in $25,000 increments, testing each other's interest levels and financial capacity. By the time the bidding reached $600,000, about half the crowd had dropped out, leaving maybe a dozen serious contenders. I waited until the price hit $650,000 before making my first bid. Partly because Frank had told me to stay patient, but mostly because I was terrified that once I started bidding, I wouldn't be able to stop. The auctioneer acknowledged my bid with a nod, and suddenly I was part of the action instead of just watching from the sidelines. The next 20 minutes felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. The bidding slowed as it approached $700,000, with longer pauses between bids as people calculated their maximum prices and risk tolerance. Two other bidders seemed particularly determined, a woman in an expensive suit who I'd seen at previous auctions, and a man in his 40s who kept checking his phone like he was getting instructions from someone else. When the bidding hit $725,000, the woman dropped out. The man with the phone stayed in until $740,000, then shook his head and stepped back from the crowd. Suddenly it was just me and one other bidder, an older gentleman I didn't recognize who'd been quiet through most of the auction. $745,000, $750,000. The auctioneer looked at me expectantly, and I realized I'd reached Frank's maximum bid. This was it. Either I'd won the property, or someone else wanted it more than we were willing to pay. $755, the auctioneer asked, looking at the other bidder. The man paused, looked around the crowd like he was expecting reinforcements to arrive, then shook his head. I'm out. $750,000. Going once, going twice. I held my breath, waiting for someone else to jump in with a last-minute bid, but the crowd remained silent. Sold to bidder number 47. Bidder number 47. That was me. Marcus Rivera, the pizza delivery guy who lived in his stepfather's basement, had just bought 2 acres of prime lakefront property in Millbrook Heights. The most expensive piece of real estate I'd ever touched, purchased with other people's money, and a plan that existed mostly in my head, and a folder full of research notes. The paperwork took another hour, but it felt like minutes. Signatures and earnest money checks and title documents that would need to be recorded at the county office. Frank had prepared me for the administrative details, but actually experiencing them was surreal. I kept expecting someone to realize there'd been a mistake, that the basement-dwelling stepson couldn't possibly be a legitimate real estate investor. But the transaction held. By noon, I was the proud owner of property that was worth more than I'd ever imagined possessing, carrying the deed in a manila envelope like it might evaporate if I didn't keep it close. The first person I called was Frank, who sounded pleased but not surprised by the results. The second call was to Susan Chen, who would handle the legal details of transferring the property into our partnership structure. The third call I didn't make. I thought about calling Richard, about sharing the news that his basement-dwelling stepson had just purchased the empty lot next door. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of his dismissive laughter when I'd first mentioned my interest in the property. Maybe it was the certainty that he'd find some way to diminish what I'd accomplished, to turn it into another reason why I was foolish and naive. Or maybe it was because I realized this was just the beginning. Buying the property was one thing, developing it successfully was something else entirely. I had 30 days to secure permanent financing and begin the process of turning 2 acres of empty land into something that would justify the price we'd paid. 30 days to prove that this wasn't just an expensive mistake, but the first step in rewriting the story of who Marcus Rivera was and what he was capable of achieving. The drive home from the courthouse felt different than any drive I'd taken before. I wasn't just returning to the basement, where I'd spent the last 3 years feeling sorry for myself. I was returning as the owner of the property next door, as someone who'd taken the first real step toward changing not just my circumstances, but my entire relationship with the neighborhood I'd felt excluded from for so long. Richard's truck was in the driveway when I pulled up, which meant he was home earlier than usual. I sat in my car for a few minutes, deed still in my lap, trying to decide how much to tell him and when. Part of me wanted to walk into the house and announce what I'd done, to see the look on his face when he realized that his lazy stepson had just become his new neighbor. But another part of me, the part that had learned to be cautious after years of having my dreams dismissed and my ambitions mocked, wanted to wait, to have more than just a purchase contract and a partnership agreement, to have something concrete and undeniable before I exposed myself to Richard's inevitable skepticism. In the end, I decided to keep quiet, not forever, but long enough to get the development process started, to have something more substantial to show than just the legal right to own 2 acres of empty land. The deed went into my dresser drawer, next to the coffee can that now held significantly less money, but somehow felt more valuable than it ever had before. That night, lying in my basement bedroom, listening to Richard and my mother moving around in the house above, I started planning not just what I would build on the Morrison property, but how I would build it. What kind of house would make the biggest statement, would most clearly demonstrate that the pizza delivery guy had become someone worth paying attention to? The answer came to me gradually, over the following days, as I met with architects and contractors, as I studied the most expensive homes that had been built in Millbrook Heights over the past few years. What I needed wasn't just a nice house, I needed a mansion, something so impressive, so obviously expensive, that no one could dismiss it as luck or accident, something that would make Richard look out his kitchen window every morning and remember the conversation where he'd laughed at my ambitions, something that would prove, once and for all, that he'd been wrong about what I was capable of achieving. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, when I found Richard standing in my driveway, arms crossed, staring at the surveyor's stakes I'd had planted along the Morrison property line. I'd hired Thompson Land Surveying to mark the exact boundaries before we started the architectural planning process, and apparently the bright orange flags had caught his attention during his morning coffee routine. "What's all this about?" he called out as I climbed out of my Honda, still wearing my Tony's Pizza uniform from the previous night shift. I'd been working extra hours to maintain some semblance of normal income while Frank and I navigated the development process, but it meant most conversations with Richard happened when I was exhausted and smelling like pepperoni. I walked over to where he stood, noting how he'd positioned himself just barely on his side of the property line, like he was claiming territory. "Just some surveying work," I said, keeping my voice neutral, making sure everything's properly marked. "Surveying work for what?" His eyes narrowed, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. Richard had built his construction business by being observant, by noticing details that other people made. The professional stakes, the precise measurements, the obvious expense of hiring a licensed surveyor, none of it fit with his image of me as an aimless pizza delivery guy. "Property development," I said simply. There was no point in lying, and part of me was curious to see how he'd react to the truth. For 3 years he'd treated me like I was invisible, like my presence in his basement was just another household maintenance issue he had to tolerate. Maybe it was time to remind him that invisible people sometimes see more than anyone realizes. He laughed, but it wasn't the casual dismissive chuckle I'd grown accustomed to. This laugh had an edge to it, like he was trying to convince himself that what he was hearing couldn't possibly be real. "Property development. Marcus, do you have any idea what it costs to develop land in this neighborhood? We're not talking about some vacant lot in the suburbs. This is Millbrook Heights." "I'm aware of where we are," I said. "I've been living here for 3 years. Living in my basement," he corrected. "There's a difference between living somewhere and being able to afford to live there." He gestured toward the surveyor's stakes with the kind of exaggerated motion he used when he was explaining something to particularly slow contractors. Those stakes represent real money, Marcus. Professional surveying, architectural plans, construction permits. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars before you even break ground. I nodded, still keeping my expression neutral. I understand the costs involved. Do you? He stepped closer, and I could smell the expensive cologne he wore to distinguish himself from the workers he supervised. Because I'm looking at a kid who counts pizza tips to pay for gas, and he's telling me he's going to develop prime lakefront property. Either you've lost your mind, or you think I'm stupid enough to believe whatever story you're trying to sell. That's when I realized that Richard wasn't just surprised by my surveying activities, he was threatened by them. For 3 years he'd maintained his position as the successful one, the provider, the man who'd rescued my mother from financial ruin and given me a place to live when I had nowhere else to go. My success, even potential success, upset the careful balance of power he'd constructed in our household. I'm not trying to sell you anything, I said. I'm just telling you what's happening on the property next door. The Morrison property. His voice rose slightly, and I saw my mother's face appear briefly in the kitchen window before disappearing again. Marcus, that property has been tied up in court for years. Even if it ever gets resolved, it's going to sell for serious money to serious developers, not to. He paused, and I could see him trying to find a way to finish the sentence without saying something he'd regret later. Not to basement-dwelling losers. Not to pizza delivery boys with delusions of grandeur. Not to people like me. Not to what? I asked. Not to people without established track records in real estate development, he said finally. This isn't a game, Marcus. If you've gotten mixed up in some kind of investment scheme, some con artist promising easy money, you need to walk away before you lose everything you have. The irony of Richard warning me about con artists wasn't lost on me, but I didn't point it out. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document, not the deed, which I was keeping safely stored, but a copy of the partnership agreement Frank and I had signed. It's not a scheme, I said, handing him the papers. It's a legitimate business partnership with experienced investors. He unfolded the document and read it with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for construction contracts. I watched his expression change as he processed the details, the property description, the purchase price, the development timeline, and most importantly, my name listed as a full partner in the venture. This says you bought the Morrison property, he said slowly, like he was reading words in a foreign language. That's correct. For $750,000, that's correct. He looked up from the document, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been respect if it hadn't been buried under so much shock. Marcus, where did you get $750,000? I didn't have $750,000, I said. I had $8,000 and a solid business plan. My partner provided the rest of the financing in exchange for a percentage of the development profits. Your partner. He said it like the concept was personally offensive to him. Who is your partner? Frank Martinez. He's a retired businessman who specializes in real estate investments. Richard's face went pale. He knew Frank Martinez, or at least knew of him. Everyone in the Millbrook Heights construction industry knew Frank Martinez. He'd made his money in manufacturing, but he'd spent the last decade financing some of the most expensive custom homes in the area. Richard had bid on several projects that Frank had funded, though he'd never been selected as the primary contractor. Frank Martinez is your business partner, Richard repeated, still studying the document like he expected it to reveal itself as an elaborate forgery. Frank Martinez is my business partner, I confirmed. That's when Richard's expression shifted from shock to something darker. The realization that I'd not only bought the property next door, but had done it with the backing of one of the area's most respected real estate investors seemed to hit him like a physical blow. For 3 years, he'd been the successful one, the connected one, the man with the reputation and the resources. Now his basement-dwelling stepson had leapfrogged over him in a single transaction. "You should have told me," he said finally. "If you were serious about getting into real estate development, I could have helped you. I know this business, Marcus. I know the contractors, the suppliers, the permit processes. You could have come to me instead of going behind my back with some outside investor." The suggestion that I'd gone behind his back was rich, considering he'd spent 3 years treating me like I didn't exist unless he needed someone to mock in front of his friends. But I could see where his mind was going. If I was going to be developing property in his neighborhood, if I was going to be working with Frank Martinez and the kind of money that represented, then maybe I wasn't the liability he'd always assumed I was. "I appreciate the offer," I said. "But Frank and I already have our development team selected." "Your development team," again with the tone that suggested I was using words I didn't understand. "Marcus, development teams aren't just about having money. They're about having relationships, knowing who does quality work and who cuts corners. Frank Martinez might have the financing, but I've got 15 years of experience building custom homes in this exact market." I could see what was happening. Richard was trying to insert himself into my project, to find a way to benefit from the success he'd never believed I could achieve. It was a familiar pattern: dismiss me when I seemed like a failure, then try to claim credit when success looked possible. "I'll mention your interest to Frank," I said, which was true enough. I would mention it right before explaining why bringing Richard into the partnership would be a terrible idea. "You do that," Richard said, folding the partnership agreement and handing it back to me. "And Marcus, next time you're planning something this significant, maybe give your family a heads up. We live here too." He walked back toward the house, leaving me standing alone among the surveyor's stakes. Through the kitchen window, I could see him talking animatedly to my mother, probably explaining what he'd just learned, and trying to figure out how to position himself to benefit from it. That evening, Frank and I met with our architect, a woman named Sarah Chen who specialized in luxury residential design. Sarah had worked on several of Frank's previous projects, and she had a reputation for creating homes that maximized both visual impact and resale value. We met at her office in downtown Millbrook Heights, a converted warehouse space that managed to feel both industrial and elegant. "The site has incredible potential," Sarah said, spreading the topographical survey across her drafting table. "The natural slope down to the lake, the mature trees, the southern exposure, you could build something truly spectacular here." She sketched rough outlines as she talked, showing how a house could be positioned to take advantage of the lake views while maintaining privacy from the neighboring properties. Her initial concepts were impressive, a contemporary design that would blend into the landscape while making a clear statement about quality and sophistication. "What's your target market?" she asked. "Young executives, empty nesters, vacation home buyers." "Actually," I said, glancing at Frank, "I want something that sends a specific message. This isn't just about building a house to sell, it's about building something that proves a point." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What kind of point?" I explained my situation, the years of living in Richard's basement, the constant dismissal of my ambitions, the way I'd been treated like a charity case in my own family. I told her about Richard's reaction to the surveyor's stakes, his assumption that I couldn't possibly be involved in legitimate real estate development. "So you want to build something that's impossible to ignore," Sarah said. "Something that makes a statement about who you've become." "Exactly." Frank leaned back in his chair, smiling slightly. "Marcus wants to build a mansion, not just a nice house, a mansion. Something that makes everyone in the neighborhood take notice." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "How much are you thinking?" "20 million, I said. The number had been floating around in my head for weeks, ever since I'd started researching the most expensive homes that had been built in Millbrook Heights. 20 million would put the house in the top tier of luxury residences, well above anything Richard had ever built. 20 million is serious money," Sarah said. "That's not just about size, it's about materials, finishes, technology, everything being absolutely top tier. Are you prepared for that level of investment? Frank and I had already discussed the financial implications. Building a $20 million house meant taking on significant debt and risk, but it also meant creating something that would appreciate substantially over time. More importantly for my purposes, it meant building something that would be impossible for Richard to dismiss or diminish. We're prepared, Frank said. The question is whether we can design something that justifies that price point while still being buildable on this site. Sarah studied the survey again, making notes and rough calculations. It's definitely possible. You'd want something in the 8 to 10,000 square foot range, probably 3 stories to take advantage of the elevation changes. Premium materials throughout, natural stone, hardwood floors, custom millwork. A chef's kitchen, with commercial-grade appliances, a master suite that's basically a luxury hotel room, entertainment spaces that could handle large gatherings. She paused, pencil hovering over the paper. The key is making sure it doesn't look ostentatious for the sake of being ostentatious. 20 million should buy you elegance and sophistication, not just size and flash. What about timeline? I asked. Design phase will take about 3 months, assuming we don't hit any major complications with zoning or environmental requirements. Permitting could add another month or 2, depending on how quickly the city processes applications. Construction for something this complex would probably take 18 to 24 months, assuming good weather and no major complications. 2 years. 2 years from breaking ground to having a finished mansion sitting next to Richard's house, a daily reminder that the pizza delivery guy he'd dismissed had accomplished something he'd never imagined possible. There's one other consideration, Sarah said. Building something this significant is going to attract attention, local media, neighborhood associations, probably some pushback from people who think you're changing the character of the area. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny? I thought about Richard's reaction to the surveyor's stakes, his assumption that I was either delusional or being conned by someone smarter than me. Public attention would mean more of the same criticism, probably amplified by people who didn't want their quiet neighborhood disrupted by major construction. I'm prepared, I said. Actually, I'm looking forward to it. The next few weeks fell into a routine that felt surreal compared to my previous 3 years of basement dwelling and pizza delivery. Days were spent meeting with contractors, engineers, and city planning officials. Evenings were still spent at Tony's, maintaining the pretense of normal life, while Frank and I navigated the complex process of turning architectural dreams into construction reality. Richard's behavior during this period was fascinating to watch. He'd gone from dismissive to curious, to actively attempting to insert himself into conversations about the project. He started asking detailed questions about our timeline, our contractor selection process, our approach to permits and inspections. Always framed as helpful advice from an experienced professional, but clearly motivated by his desire to understand how I'd managed to leapfrog him in the local real estate hierarchy. You know, he said one evening as I was heading out for my delivery shift, I've been thinking about your project. Frank Martinez is a smart investor, but he's not a hands-on construction guy. You're going to need someone who understands the day-to-day realities of managing a high-end build. We're interviewing general contractors next week, I said. Frank has some recommendations from his previous projects. I could throw my hat in the ring, Richard said, trying to sound casual. I've built plenty of custom homes in this price range, might make sense to keep it in the family. The idea of Richard serving as general contractor on my $20 million mansion was so absurd that I almost laughed out loud, not because he wasn't qualified. His construction business was successful, and he'd built some impressive homes over the years, but because the power dynamic would be impossible to navigate. Richard had spent 3 years treating me like a dependent child. I couldn't imagine him taking orders from me on a construction site. I'll mention it to Frank, I said, which had become my standard response to Richard's increasingly frequent suggestions about how I should manage my business. You do that, he said. And Marcus, I hope you know what you're getting into. $20 million is a lot of money to risk on your first development project. The concern in his voice might have been genuine, but it was undercut by the obvious calculation behind it. Richard wasn't worried about my financial well-being, he was worried about being left out of the biggest project to happen in his neighborhood in years. That weekend Frank and I met with 3 potential general contractors. All of them had experience with luxury residential construction, and all of them understood the unique challenges of building on a lakefront site. The interviews were conducted at Frank's office, a modest space that belied his substantial real estate portfolio. The first contractor was a large commercial firm that specialized in high-end residential projects. They had an impressive portfolio and substantial resources, but their approach felt impersonal, like they viewed our mansion as just another line item in their project management software. The second contractor was a smaller operation run by a husband and wife team who'd built several spectacular homes in the area. They were more personal and detail-oriented, but they seemed intimidated by the scope and budget of our project. The third contractor was Tom Morrison, no relation to the family that had owned our property. Tom ran a mid-sized operation that had built some of the most expensive homes in Millbrook Heights over the past decade. He was confident without being arrogant, experienced without being set in his ways, and he had a clear vision for how to approach our project. $20 million is a serious budget, Tom said, reviewing Sarah's preliminary drawings. But it's also an opportunity to build something truly special. The key is making sure every dollar goes toward quality and impact, not just size for the sake of size. He outlined his approach, assembling a team of specialized subcontractors who'd worked together on previous luxury projects, maintaining tight quality control throughout the construction process and building in contingencies for the inevitable complications that arose with ambitious projects. Timeline? Frank asked. 22 months from breaking ground to final walkthrough, Tom said. Could be faster if everything goes perfectly, but I'd rather underpromise and overdeliver than leave you scrambling to meet an unrealistic deadline. Budget management? I asked. Fixed price contract with clearly defined change order procedures. You'll know exactly what you're paying for, and any modifications will be documented and approved before work begins. No surprises, no cost overruns that could have been avoided with better planning. By the end of the meeting, Frank and I both knew we'd found our general contractor. Tom had the experience, the resources, and the confidence to handle a project this complex. More importantly, he treated me as an equal partner in the venture, not as a young investor who needed constant guidance and supervision. There's one thing I should mention, Tom said as we were wrapping up the meeting. Building something this significant in a neighborhood like Millbrook Heights is going to generate a lot of interest, some of it positive, some of it negative. People are going to have opinions about what you're building and why you're building it. What kind of opinions? I asked. Some neighbors will be excited about having a high-end property that increases their own home values. Others will be concerned about construction noise, traffic, and disruption to the neighborhood character. City council members might get involved if they think the project is too large or too ostentatious for the area. He paused, studying my expression. The question is whether you're building this house because you want to live in it, or because you want to prove something to people who've underestimated you. Because that distinction will affect how you handle the inevitable pushback. It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding thinking about too directly. The truth was that proving something to Richard and everyone else who dismissed me was a huge part of my motivation. But so was the desire to create something beautiful and significant, to leave a mark on the landscape that would outlast whatever petty grievances had motivated its construction. Maybe it's both, I said. Maybe proving something to other people and building something worthwhile aren't mutually exclusive. Tom nodded. As long as you're honest about your motivations, that's fine. The problems arise when people convince themselves they're building for noble reasons when they're really just trying to settle scores. But if you can own both motivations, you'll make better decisions throughout the process. We signed the contract the following week. 22 months, fixed price with a construction schedule that would begin as soon as the city approved our building permits. Everything was falling into place exactly as I'd imagined, except for one detail I hadn't fully considered: the reaction from my immediate neighbors. The first indication came in the form of a certified letter addressed to me at Richard's house. It was from the Millbrook Heights Neighborhood Association, a group I'd never heard of but which apparently had strong opinions about proposed developments in the area. "Dear Mr. Rivera," the letter began, "we have received notification of your proposed construction project at 847 Lakeshore Drive. While we appreciate investment in our community, we have concerns about the scale and impact of the proposed development." The letter went on to outline various objections: the size of the proposed house relative to other homes in the neighborhood, the potential impact on traffic and infrastructure, the precedent it might set for future development in the area. It concluded with an invitation to attend a neighborhood association meeting where I could address their concerns and hopefully modify my plans to be more compatible with the community care. "You're famous," Richard said when I showed him the letter. "The whole neighborhood is talking about your mansion. What are they saying?" Mixed reactions. Some people are excited about having a $20 million property next door. Others think you're trying to turn Millbrook Heights into some kind of gated community for billionaires. He paused, and I could see him weighing how much to tell me. There's also some speculation about how a pizza delivery guy suddenly came up with the money for a project like this. People are wondering if you're fronting for some out-of-state developer, or if there's some kind of money laundering situation involved. The suggestion that I might be involved in money laundering was both offensive and predictable. It was easier for people to believe I was a criminal than to accept that I'd actually managed to put together a legitimate real estate deal. "Let them speculate," I said. "The permits are approved, the contracts are signed, and we break ground in 3 weeks. Anyone who wants to know how the financing works can ask Frank Martinez." "You might want to go to that neighborhood association meeting," Richard said. "Not because you have to, but because it would be smart politics. These people are going to be your neighbors for a long time." It was good advice, and I knew it. But something about the tone of the letter, the assumption that I needed to justify my plans to a group of people who'd never bothered to acknowledge my existence when I was living in their neighborhood as Richard's dependent, made me want to ignore their concerns entirely. "I'll think about it," I said. "You should do more than think about it," Richard said. "You should show up and explain your vision for the project. Show them you're not some outsider trying to disrupt their community, but someone who's invested in making the neighborhood better." The irony of Richard encouraging me to present myself as an invested community member wasn't lost on me. For 3 years he'd treated me like an unwelcome guest in his own house. Now that I was building a mansion next door, suddenly I was someone worth defending. "Why do you care what the neighbors think?" I asked. "Because I live here too," Richard said. "If your project generates controversy, if people start complaining to the city council or organizing opposition campaigns, it affects all of us. Better to address their concerns up front than deal with organized resistance later." He was right, of course. Building a $20 million mansion was about more than just construction and design. It was about managing relationships and expectations in a community where I'd always been an outsider. The neighborhood association meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community center, a modest building that served as the hub for various local organizations. I arrived 20 minutes early, partly to scope out the crowd and partly to calm my nerves before what promised to be a hostile audience. About 40 people had gathered in the main meeting room, mostly middle-aged homeowners who looked like they'd come straight from dinner at the country club. I recognized a few faces from Richard's occasional parties, but most were strangers who'd apparently heard enough about my project to form strong opinions about it. The association president was a woman named Linda Harrison, who lived 3 houses down from Richard and had apparently appointed herself as the spokesperson for neighborhood concerns. She opened the meeting by outlining the association's mission to preserve the character and quality of life in Millbrook Heights, then launched into a detailed critique of my proposed mansion. "While we appreciate Mr. Rivera's investment in our community," she said, reading from prepared notes, We're concerned that a $20 million residence will set a precedent that could fundamentally change the nature of our neighborhood. Millbrook Heights has always been a place where successful professionals could enjoy lakefront living without the ostentation and excess of more exclusive communities. The implication was clear: my mansion represented ostentation and excess, qualities that were incompatible with the understated elegance that supposedly characterized the neighborhood. Never mind that several of the homes within a mile of my property had sold for well over $10 million in recent years, or that the understated elegance of Millbrook Heights was itself a form of ostentation that just happened to be more socially acceptable. Additionally, Linda continued, we have questions about the financing and development team behind this project. Rivera has been a resident of our community for several years, but he hasn't been involved in local organizations or activities that would demonstrate his commitment to neighborhood values. That was rich. I hadn't been involved in local organizations because I'd been working 60-hour weeks delivering pizzas while living in my stepfather's basement. But apparently, my failure to join the tennis club or volunteer for charity fundraisers was evidence that I didn't share the community's values. When Linda finished her presentation, she opened the floor for questions. The first few were relatively polite inquiries about construction timeline, traffic impact, and environmental considerations. But as the evening progressed, the questions became more pointed and personal. Mr. Rivera, said a man I didn't recognize, can you explain how someone in your position was able to secure financing for a project of this magnitude? I partnered with an experienced investor who provided the necessary capital, I said. Frank Martinez has financed several successful developments in this area. But what's your personal financial contribution to the project? Pressed another questioner. Are you the actual owner of this property, or are you just the public face for outside investors? I felt my jaw clench. The suggestion that I was just a front for mysterious outside investors was both insulting and revealing. These people couldn't accept that someone they'd dismissed as irrelevant might have accomplished something significant without their knowledge or approval. I'm a full partner in the development venture, I said. The property is owned by a limited liability company that I control in partnership with Mr. Martinez. All financing has been secured through legitimate sources and properly documented with the appropriate regulatory agencies. What about your long-term plans? Asked Linda Harrison. Are you building this house as a personal residence or as a speculative investment that you'll sell to out-of-state buyers? My plans are to build a beautiful home that enhances the value and character of the neighborhood, I said. What I do with the property after it's completed is my business, just like what any other homeowner does with their property is their business. The room fell silent for a moment, and I could see people exchanging glances. My response had been more confrontational than they'd expected, and they weren't sure how to react. Rivera, said a woman sitting in the front row, I think what we're trying to understand is whether this project reflects a genuine commitment to our community or whether it's motivated by other factors that might not be compatible with neighborhood harmony. I knew what she was really asking. She was asking whether I was building the mansion to prove something to Richard, to get revenge on the people who'd ignored me, to force my way into a social circle that had never welcomed me. She was asking whether my motivations were pure enough to deserve their approval. Ma'am, I said, standing up and looking around the room, I've lived in this neighborhood for 3 years. During that time, not one person in this room has ever introduced themselves to me, invited me to a neighborhood event, or acknowledged my existence in any meaningful way. Now that I'm building something significant, suddenly everyone has opinions about my motivations and my worthiness to be part of this community. The room was completely quiet now. I could see Linda Harrison shuffling her notes nervously, probably trying to figure out how to regain control of the meeting. You want to know why I'm building a $20 million mansion, I continued. Because I can. Because I worked hard, saved money, found partners who believed in my vision, and put together a deal that makes financial sense. I don't need your approval, I don't need your permission, and I don't need to justify my success to people who never bothered to notice my existence when I wasn't successful. I gathered my jacket and headed toward the door. The construction starts in 3 weeks. If you have legitimate concerns about noise, traffic, or safety, you can contact my general contractor. If you just don't like the idea of someone like me building something impressive in your neighborhood, that's not my problem. As I walked out of the community center, I could hear the buzz of conversation behind me. Some people were probably offended by my directness, others might have been impressed by my willingness to stand up to their implied criticism. But for the first time since I'd bought the Morrison property, I felt completely confident in what I was doing and why I was doing it. The truth was that Linda Harrison and her neighborhood association friends were right about my motivations. I was building the mansion partly to prove something, partly to get revenge on people who'd underestimated me, partly to force my way into a community that had never welcomed me. But so what? Those weren't noble motivations, but they weren't evil ones either. And if the end result was a beautiful home that increased property values and enhanced the neighborhood, did it really matter why I'd built it? Driving home that night, I realized that the neighborhood association meeting had clarified something important for me. I'd been worried about what other people would think of my project, concerned about appearing too ambitious or too ostentatious. But the meeting had shown me that no matter what I built or how I built it, some people would find reasons to criticize it. Better to build something I was proud of than to compromise my vision in a futile attempt to win approval from people who'd already decided I didn't belong. 3 weeks later, Tom Morrison's crew broke ground on what would become the most expensive house ever built in Millbrook Heights. Richard stood at his kitchen window that morning, coffee mug in hand, watching the excavators tear into the earth where he'd once dismissed my dreams as impossible fantasies. I stood next to my Honda Civic, still in my Tony's Pizza uniform, watching the same excavators begin the process of turning 2 years of planning into physical reality. In 22 months, this empty lot would hold a mansion that no one in the neighborhood could ignore or dismiss. But first, we had to build it. 20 months after breaking ground, I stood in the marble foyer of my completed mansion, watching the final contractor pack up his tools. The house had cost exactly $21.3 million, slightly over budget, due to upgrades Frank and I had decided were worth the additional investment. Every surface gleamed with perfection: hand-carved Italian marble floors, Brazilian hardwood stairs with custom iron railings, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered unobstructed views of the lake. The house was everything I'd envisioned and more. 10,000 square feet spread across 3 levels, with a master suite that occupied half the second floor, a gourmet kitchen that could have served a high-end restaurant, and a wine cellar that descended into the hillside like something from a European villa. The outdoor spaces were equally impressive: infinity pool, outdoor kitchen, terraced gardens that cascaded down toward the lake. But the most satisfying feature wasn't visible from inside the house. It was the view from Richard's kitchen window, where he could see every detail of what I'd accomplished every time he poured his morning coffee. I'd moved out of his basement 6 months earlier, as soon as the house was weatherproofed and had basic utilities. Those final months of construction had been spent living in what would eventually become the guest suite, watching Richard's expressions change as the magnitude of my project became impossible to ignore. The housewarming party was scheduled for Saturday evening. I'd invited everyone: the neighborhood association members who'd questioned my motivations, the contractors who'd built something extraordinary, Frank and Sarah and Tom, and everyone else who'd helped turn an impossible dream into physical reality. Even Richard and my mother, though I suspected their attendance would be motivated more by curiosity than celebration. Friday morning, I was reviewing catering arrangements when I heard a knock at the front door. Through the glass panels, I could see Richard standing on my portico, looking smaller somehow than he had when he'd controlled every aspect of my living situation. "Impressive," he said when I opened the door. He stepped inside without being invited, his work boots echoing against the marble floors. $21 million buys a lot of house. It does, I agreed. Would you like a tour? He nodded, and I led him through the main level, the great room with its 30-foot ceilings and custom chandelier, the kitchen with its professional-grade appliances and handcrafted cabinetry, the library with built-in shelving that reached to the coffered ceiling. Richard examined everything with the critical eye of someone who understood construction quality, and I could see his grudging respect for the craftsmanship. "Frank Martinez doesn't cut corners," he said as we climbed the main staircase. "This is museum-quality work." The master suite drew an audible whistle. The bedroom alone was larger than most apartments, with a sitting area that faced the lake and a fireplace surrounded by book-matched marble slabs. The bathroom featured a soaking tub carved from a single piece of stone and a shower that could accommodate 6 people comfortably. "This is your bedroom?" Richard asked. "This is my bedroom." He walked to the windows that overlooked his property. From this angle, his house looked modest, almost quaint compared to the scale of what surrounded us. "You can see our kitchen from here. I can see your entire property from here." We stood in silence for a moment, both of us understanding the implications of that statement. For 3 years, Richard had looked down on me literally and figuratively, relegating me to his basement, while he enjoyed the elevated status of the successful homeowner. Now our positions were reversed, and the elevation difference was measured in both feet and dollars. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why? What? Why did you build this? You could have built a nice house for $5 million, something that would have been perfectly respectable. Instead, you built something that's going to be photographed for architecture magazines. Something that makes every other house in the neighborhood look ordinary." I considered his question carefully. The honest answer was complicated, involving years of accumulated resentment, a desire to prove myself, and the simple satisfaction of achieving something that had seemed impossible. But there was also a deeper truth about what the house represented. "Because I could," I said. "Because when everyone told me I'd never amount to anything, never be more than a pizza delivery guy living in someone else's basement, I decided to prove them wrong in a way that couldn't be argued with or dismissed." "And did you prove them wrong?" I gestured toward the windows that framed the lake like a living painting. "What do you think?" Richard walked to the far end of the master suite, where French doors opened onto a private balcony. From there, the house's position on the hillside provided views that stretched for miles along the shoreline. "I think you proved something," he said. "I'm just not sure what it was." That evening, the party began at 7. By 8, my house was filled with the kind of people who'd never spoken to me when I was delivering their pizzas, but were suddenly eager to discuss real estate investments and development opportunities. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I found myself enjoying their attention more than I'd expected. Linda Harrison from the Neighborhood Association arrived fashionably late, wearing a dress that probably cost more than I used to make in 3 months. She moved through the house with the focused attention of someone conducting an appraisal, examining finishes and fixtures like she was gathering evidence for some future argument. "Mr. Rivera," she said, finding me in the great room where I was talking with Frank and Tom about our next potential project. "This is quite an achievement. I have to admit, when you first proposed this project, I wasn't sure what to expect. And now I think you've built something that will be a landmark in our community for generations. Property values in the neighborhood have already increased substantially just from having this house under construction." The admission clearly cost her something, but she delivered it with the gracious smile of someone who decided that being wrong about my capabilities was less important than being associated with my success. Frank raised his glass. "To Marcus," he said loudly enough for the conversation to pause, "for having the vision to see what others couldn't, and the determination to make it happen." The toast was echoed throughout the room, and I found myself surrounded by people who wanted to shake my hand, discuss potential business opportunities, and somehow associate themselves with what I'd accomplished. 3 years earlier, most of these people wouldn't have acknowledged my existence. Now they were treating me like someone whose friendship might be worth cultivating. My mother arrived alone, Richard having decided at the last minute that he wasn't comfortable attending. She moved through the house quietly, taking in details without commenting, her expression unreadable. When she reached the master suite, she stood at the windows for a long time, looking out at the lake and the property where she'd raised me after my father died. "He's proud of you," she said when I joined her on the balcony. "Richard. He won't admit it, but he's proud of what you've accomplished." "Is he?" "He spent 20 years building his business to the point where he could afford our house. You did something bigger in 2 years, starting from nothing." She paused. "It scares him, I think. The idea that maybe he didn't understand you as well as he thought he did." It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get from either of them, and I decided to accept it as such. Richard had treated me badly, but he'd also provided a roof over my head when I had nowhere else to go. My success didn't erase his failures as a stepfather, but it did make them seem less important than they once had. The party wound down around midnight. As the last guests departed, I found myself alone in the house that had consumed 2 years of my life and proved something I'd needed to prove. The space felt enormous and quiet, a monument to ambition and stubbornness, and the power of refusing to accept other people's limitations. I walked through the empty rooms, turning off lights and setting the security system, thinking about what came next. The house was finished, but the business Frank and I had built together was just getting started. We'd already identified 3 other properties in the area with development potential, and my success with the mansion had established credibility that would make future projects easier to finance. But more than that, I'd learned something about myself that I'd never fully understood before. I wasn't just someone who'd gotten lucky or found the right partners at the right time. I was someone who could envision something extraordinary and make it happen through planning, persistence, and the willingness to risk everything on a dream that other people couldn't see. Standing in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, looking out at the lake that reflected the lights of my house like scattered diamonds, I realized that the mansion had accomplished everything I'd hoped it would. It had proven that Richard was wrong about my potential. It had forced the neighborhood to acknowledge my existence and my success. It had transformed me from someone who lived in other people's spaces to someone who created spaces that others envied. But the most important thing it had proven was something I'd needed to prove to myself, that the basement-dwelling pizza delivery guy had never been the real Marcus Rivera. He'd just been someone I was pretending to be until I figured out who I actually was. The real Marcus Rivera was someone who bought impossible properties and built extraordinary houses. Someone who turned $8,000 in savings into a $20 million asset. Someone who refused to accept limitations that other people tried to impose on him. The next morning, I woke up in my master suite to the sound of Richard's alarm clock penetrating the walls between our properties. For 3 years, I'd been woken up by the sounds of his household routine, constantly reminded that I was living in his space on his terms. Now his alarm was just background noise, no more significant than the birds singing in the trees that landscaped my property. I made coffee in my kitchen and walked out onto the main terrace, where the morning sun was burning off the mist that rose from the lake. Across the water, I could see other houses similar to mine, monuments to other people's success and ambition. In the distance, construction cranes marked the locations of future projects, new mansions being built by people who'd learned the same lesson I had, that in America, you could transform yourself completely if you were willing to work hard enough and dream big enough. Richard appeared in his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, looking out at my house the way I'd once looked out of his basement window at the world I'd thought I could never be part of. He raised his mug in a small salute, and I returned the gesture. There was no anger left between us. No resentment that needed settling. We'd both learned what we needed to learn about each other and ourselves. The mansion was complete, but the story it told was just beginning. Every morning for the rest of his life, Richard would look out his kitchen window and see proof that he'd been wrong about what I was capable of achieving. Every morning for the rest of my life, I'd wake up in a house that reminded me that impossible dreams were just dreams that required more work than most people were willing to do. And sometimes, that reminder was worth $20 million and 2 years of your life to create. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.